You're going to be looking at today a hydrated compound lab. Now, a hydrated compound is a compound like this. It has, in this case, copper sulfate times some amount, there should be a whole number here, but I'm not putting it in yet, H2O. So there's some amount of water in the structure. And it turns out that if you heat up a hydrated compound, you can drive off the water and end up with only the copper sulfate. So what we're going to do is in an evaporating dish, we're going to put a little bit of this copper sulfate, weigh it, heat it up. We're going to heat it up for about 10 minutes. It'll change color. It'll go from a blue color to a pale green to burnt looking green color. Then after we heat it for about 10 minutes, we're going to turn off the heat, let it cool off so that we can pick it up, and then we're going to weigh it. That'll give us an initial mass after heating. Then we'll heat it a second time. After the second heating, we'll compare the two masses after the heating. And as long as the two masses are within 1/100 of a gram of each other, then we're done heating. That means that we've completely dried it out and we have no water left in our structure. And then if we can convert the mass that's lost, because the lost mass is all water. So when we get the mass that's lost, we can figure out the moles of that, compare my moles of copper sulfate to moles of water, and we'll figure out a whole number ratio of, for every one water, for every one copper sulfate, there's some amount of water that we'll have in the structure. So you'll be analyzing all of this data and looking at it and submitting a lab report. One of the first things that we need to do in the lab is get the mass of a clean evaporating dish, which we have here, and it's 32.052 grams. That'll be the mass of our evaporating dish when we start. The next step in the lab calls for us to measure out approximately 2 grams of the copper sulfate, which is that blue powder that you can see in the evaporating dish, and to re-weigh it. So my mass with the copper sulfate is 34.055 grams. The next step calls for us to heat our copper sulfate, and we'll use this setup where we have the Bunsen burner, and then we have some wire gauze and the evaporating dish on top of it, and we're just going to let it heat. As it heats up, it'll start to change color. We'll also want to stir it around a little bit and break up any clumps that form on top, because the copper sulfate has some water in the structure, and as the water evaporates out, it'll start to change color. Once that it's done heating, then we'll let it cool off and we'll re-weigh it and see how much mass was lost due to the water evaporating. I've been heating this for several minutes now, and I've stirred it up some, and you can see that most of the pale blue color has left, and it's turning this kind of greenish color. When it all turns that color and we heat it for a few more minutes, it'll be about to where all of the water has been driven off. This is the copper sulfate after heating it up, and next I'm going to weigh it, and then we'll heat it up again for a few minutes and double check and make sure that we get it to a consistent mass. The copper sulfate and evaporating dish have now been moved to the balance. On the balance, we can read that the mass is 33.345 grams. We are into the second heating, and we're heating it to make sure that our mass is consistent. So I'll heat it a second time and make sure it weighs about the same thing. After the second heating, we put the evaporating dish back onto the balance and get a second mass. and this mass is 33.342, which is essentially the same as the first mass that we got after heating, which means that we have heated it now to a consistent mass. So now we've completed the lab. You need to do the lab calculations, which means that you just have to roll through. The instructions are on the bottom of the lab sheet, and you'll do those instructions, and then you'll turn in your lab to me on Schoology.